Hello and welcome back to the latest episode of the AIIM Growth Partners Podcast, the podcast where we dive into the minds of some of the most interesting and inspiring leaders from across the technology landscape and unpack the strategies underpinning their success. My name is David Loader. I'm the founder of AIIM Growth Partners and I am your host. Today, I'm joined by Saj Huq, the Chief Commercial Officer of Plexal. Saj, welcome to the show.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me. So I'm Chief Commercial Officer of Plexal. I've been with the business for approaching 8 years. I know we'll kind of go into more detail about some of the work we do, but prior to Plexal, my background is a mix of military experience, consulting experience, and then working in private equity-backed companies. So I worked for a startup before Plexal. Ultimately, what drew me to the organization back in 2018 when I joined was the opportunity to work in the innovation ecosystem, get much closer to emerging technology and collaborate with startups directly.
You spoke about the military experience. Keen to sort of understand how those 7 years or so, in the military, how that's really kind of shaped your leadership approach and your kind of mindset. I think there's a lot of commonalities between the mission-driven approaches of the military and what these startups are you're working with. So I'd love you to kind of talk and develop that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So, joining the Royal Air Force, which I did, was a kind of boyhood dream. Like I always wanted to fly airplanes. I was passionate about aviation when I was young. So it was a goal that I had since a very early age, which I pursued all the way through school and into university. I initially joined the RAF as a reservist whilst I was at university. And that was a really good grounding in a number of areas. Number one is, just an introduction or a soft introduction to military life. It was an interesting kind of addition to my university experience as well. So it was quite fun. Got to do some cool things like adventurous training and hone those leadership skills of, working in teams, exposing yourselves to new challenges, but also learning some interesting skills that kind of set me up for my immediate future in the Air Force straight away, but then into my broader business career. It's also when I learned to fly initially as well. I joined the Air Force full time after graduation. The first kind of step you do is initial officer training, which is just under a year's worth of leadership training. And obviously at that moment in your career, it's about setting you up to be a commissioned officer in the military. It's very, very similar between the three services in terms of, the expectations, the processes you go through. Obviously, there's a bit of a kind of service specific element to the training you do. But interestingly, when I joined the RAF, I was so fixated initially on just getting to flying training, which was the step after officer training. If I'm honest, at the time, I didn't really appreciate the opportunity that going through almost year's worth of leadership training presented. It's really funny that as an enduring set of experiences, those experiences were really formative for me and things that I've drawn on in my career afterwards, how to manage teams, how to balance the differing needs between, key tasks that you need to complete, the individual needs, an overarching strategic objective, how to motivate, how to, and also just understanding how you operate in times of pressure and stress as well. In my current role, I'm really fortunate to play a management role in an organization that's fast growing. It's very dynamic. We've got colleagues based across the UK and projects delivering across the world. Things are always changing. And actually the core essence of a lot of my day to day is about working with people and managing people. So many of those experiences that I learned right at the start of my career when I joined the Air Force are actually even more relevant now. And I'm really fortunate to have had them.
I love it how you kind of talked about like you were so unexpected, all of the positive outcomes that have come from that. My brother-in-law has just gone down to Sandhurst a few weeks ago. So I'm glad that we kind of started with that. Coming on to then Plexal and what you're doing now. And I think we're probably going to work backwards to what you're doing with Lorca as well and whatnot. But talk to us today about Plexal and what the Plexal kind of mission statement is and what you really help do.
Yeah. So Plexal's mission is to solve society's challenges through collaboration on emerging tech. Our approach is really to focus on those national priorities. We call that kind of government-led innovation. So really the government of the day, their science and technology priorities, their key societal issues they want to address, whether it's economic growth, whether it's driving security and resilience. We look to focus intently on that, understand the opportunity for our country and also across our partnerships, the UK's partnerships globally. And what we tend to do is bring together public and private sectors around those initiatives We deliver a whole suite of services, so everything from innovation programs through to providing strategy consulting and advisory services, through to helping local government to develop clusters, through to providing one-to-one support to really promising companies through our growth partnership initiative. And really all of that effort is about bringing together a full kind of operating system of support to drive the UK's growth, its science and tech development and advantage, and really enhance our security and resilience over the long term too.
Gotcha. And I understand with Plexal, some of the kind of key initiatives you're aligning on with the government is in cybersecurity, AI, and sovereign technology. Talk to me about why this is a key priority for the government and how you're helping kind of facilitate that.
Yeah, it's I mean, all of those areas are critical priorities. I mean, our original area of focus was cybersecurity. So when I joined the business back in 2018, we were quite a small organization at the time. We were in the early stages of running what was known as LORCA, which was the London Cyber Innovation Centre, one of two national innovation centres for cybersecurity. It was a government-backed initiative which was funded by the predecessor to the Department of Science, Innovation, Technology. It was called DCMS at the time, rather. And that was really funded as part of the UK's national cybersecurity strategy, where the government basically took the approach to understand that security presented a unique opportunity to both enhance critical industries across the UK's economy, that the preserve of cybersecurity and by extension national security is no longer just you can't just rely on the government to do that. You need industry to kind of step up and build resilience as well. But actually in doing so, it presents a huge growth opportunity if you can nurture and stimulate an ecosystem, if you can help, cultivate fast growing companies with new technologies, products and services. So they funded a whole swathe of innovation programs. LORCA was the biggest one. And I was a program director for that initiative. It grew to be the world's largest cybersecurity accelerator, supported over 72 companies through 5 different programs over 3 years, raising over £300 million worth of equity investment into those companies, and many of whom are still thriving, have become global businesses today. But really, that was the kind of cybersecurity journey. Since then, we've continued to obviously to operate in that space. I'm sure we'll touch on that later. But I think that was the predecessor for a new way of working on technology between government and industry, where most of the innovation is happening in the private sector. Government needs to influence and help support the direction the industry is taking, but also has an opportunity to cultivate the benefits that accrue through that technology to enhance our economic growth and security. And we're seeing the same features play out in other technologies which are transformative, specifically AI and quantum at the moment, where they're so transformative, game-changing technology. Lots of opportunity to create, a whole new industries, transform our economy at large, but also they present both risk and opportunity from a security and resilience perspective. That's typically where we tend to operate because those spaces are complex to navigate. The solutions in those areas to these cross-cutting challenges and are never the preserve of one organization or one industry. And so it needs that kind of binding agent, which is effectively what we do as Plexal.
And I'm really interested in sort of unpacking how Plexal has been so successful, because even just before this call, I was looking at all the accelerator programs that are out there, all supposedly on the label kind of doing the same thing. Yet, as you mentioned there, the success and the scale, and I was reading one of the recent Plexal reports saying that I think the ROI was best part of £14 for every pound that the government spent on Plexal and your programs. So talk about what you've kind of learned through LORCA and Plexal as to how you can really drive outcome through your program.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So a couple of things I would say. You're right. It's not just about the process. So the programmatic intervention and the element that supports a company directly that generates the benefit, but it's actually about the community and the platform that you build around those programs, the ecosystem. A core part of our work is about both building physical and virtual communities that bring together all of these cross-cutting stakeholders across an ecosystem. So, in cybersecurity and AI, that would be, of course, the innovators, the startups, the scale-ups themselves, but also those who are enabling that growth. So the investor community across the whole kind of capital stack. The early adopters of those technologies, both in enterprise as well as government, the national security community that could benefit from the cutting edge innovation that can drive our national security mission, the international partners who could who could receive UK exports and help, to transform their own economies and therefore creating kind of global growth as well. Ultimately, that's what we've been setting out to do for the last 8.5 years, is to build those kind of international and comprehensive networks. And it's access to that whole ecosystem and community, which we think is the advantage. If you're an individual entrepreneur, it's really difficult to build these networks yourself, particularly if you're a first-time founder. Obviously, the best founders are, they're incredibly focused and full of energy and hungry to do that. And inevitably, they will succeed at whatever they do. But if we can at least accelerate that process a little bit, or, and also, I guess, democratize access to entrepreneurship and opportunity. And for those, not just the preserve of those who've done it before, or those who know the right people, have the right access. Actually, there's more people who can get into the space and actually create new economic value. I feel like that's a really important role to play, and that's ultimately what we look to do.
Absolutely. And I find it so inspiring, as we've spoken before. Like, I regularly go to the Manchester office and see many of the people on the Cyber Runway program. And it's amazing when you're speaking to these people and everyone's getting in rooms and getting in front of the right people, which, as you mentioned, if they're just sort of a solopreneur or an early stage founder, it's going to be nigh on impossible to do that. Talking about Plexal, it's not sort of a one size fits all. You've got various programs you run for businesses at different stages of their journey. Can we zoom in and look at that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So if I kind of talk about our cyber programs initially, because I think there's quite a specialized pathway. So we run a program called Cyber Runway. We've now delivered that program for approaching 5 years. And again, it's a UK government funded program. That's got quite prescribed pathways. So we help companies at their earliest stages, they're probably pre-product market fit or early product stage, prototype stage, in terms of getting to market and validating the problems they're trying to solve. And also to connect with, hopefully, their initial community of early adopters, design partners, and ultimately long-term customers, hopefully. So that's Cyber Runway Grow. We also have a scale element to that program, which is supporting those that already have quite significant momentum behind them. Maybe they've raised some investment, they've taken some institutional funding, or they're kind of approaching quite significant revenues. And then the opportunity for them is really to provide a lot more kind of scaling advice, both at a kind of company level. So how do you set your business up to scale? But also in terms of, how do you go into new markets? How do you continue to innovate on your product as you scale out your customer base? How do you think about internationalization as well? And then we've got a couple of other streams. One, which specifically is a mentorship stream called Ignite, which is much more about actually helping the leader of a business transition from that founder to CEO role, which is, really difficult when you go from that kind of founder operator role to trying to professionalize and operate much more at scale as a CEO of hopefully a growing company. So those are examples of where in a specific domain, in this case, cybersecurity, we've got different interventions that can help for different elements of the growth journey. And, within that also deep dives into particular sectors such as critical national infrastructure, where there's a big demand for new technology and new approaches. Beyond that, we run a whole swathe of kind of tech agnostic programs. So, we run kind of scale up accelerators for some of the fastest growing companies in the UK. That's really nice to operate actually, because you get access and insight into the whole swathe of technologies across lots of different industries, which I really, really enjoy. Many of these programs, I should say, are at a minimum national, but we also run some international programs as well, including one for the Singapore government, which we've been running for the last 18 months as well. And then lastly, we have also run a number of kind of corporately funded accelerators and programs, for some of the hyperscalers, but also other critical defense and security partners, including Airbus, whom we ran a space tech accelerator a couple of years ago. So there's a whole kind of mix of, either a specific intervention within a domain at a specific stage to address a very particular kind of growth pain point, or a kind of broader type of program for a wider spectrum of companies, or, a particular opportunity to help cultivate an ecosystem that can drive a specific industry and a main operator within that industry forward as well. So quite a few different types of programs that we run.
And so what do you think are the main benefits of working with businesses at these various different stages and working across, as you said, on these tech agnostic programs rather than just being cybersecurity, pre-product market fit? What's the benefit of having businesses at all different stages of journey and all different kind of product sets?
I think what's interesting actually is if you kind of abstract above the individual domain or the specific domain, many of the challenges that, particularly if you're in a kind of, say, for argument's sake, we're talking about B2B kind of tech space, right? Many of the kind of growth challenges are relatively similar. I mean, every entrepreneur needs a foundational set of skills. And if you're building a business and you're managing and operating a company, you need a broad range of skills, and those are kind of transferable, whether you're in cybersecurity or AI or an adjacent space. So it's also quite interesting actually to be able to help people across different areas, but also identify lessons learned in adjacent spaces and pull them into, say cybersecurity. I find in cyber, and it actually probably similar in the AI space, particularly some of the areas we operate in. So for example, we run some initiatives in the AI security space. Tends to be very technical by nature. The problems are technical, the customers are technical, but also the founders typically come from a technical background. And sometimes, but not always, but sometimes you find that maybe some of that rounder kind of business skill set is lacking, or rather is less developed. Which is why actually drawing in insights from the broader kind of business community, from the broader kind of tech ecosystem is really helpful. And then lastly, I guess the point I'd make is increasing this convergence between these technologies. A large number of cybersecurity companies will also identify as being AI or AI adjacent. In other kind of enterprise technology spaces, there's a lot of overlap with security sometimes we see as well. An example being fintech and cyber, there's a lot of overlap in some areas as well. And so actually just stovepiping into separate systems, I don't think it's necessarily that relevant anymore. So that's the kind of opportunity, I guess, of having that horizontal view across technology, as well as the kind of the domain expertise for a specific area too.
Mm. I think it's so interesting what I've kind of observed from some of my interactions with the businesses there. I say there within the Barclays Eagle Lab and people on the Cyber Runway program is, them kind of integrating and mixing with businesses that are not cyber experts. Many of these people have been cyber practitioners for life and have always been surrounded by techie people. All of a sudden, what sounds like a brilliant kind of pitch or a, mission statement to a techie person could not be understood by someone that isn't from security. And that helps them sort of reframe. And then when that person's sort of re-articulating, okay, so this is what you do, they think, actually, we've identified a whole new opportunity that we previously discounted. So instead of swimming in this kind of red ocean, there's actually a blue ocean where no one's tackling this problem in this specific sector or framing it in this way. And I think that's really powerful, that if it's just security people who are all generally going to be looking at a problem or looking at the market in the same way, there's going to be that sort of tunnel vision and that narrower focus.
100%. If I may, I just add two things to that, is that I think sometimes, I see this in particular in cybersecurity, I do think it can be hard to break in as an outsider. I think that's because of this inherent, you sometimes get this mindset with particularly people who've been in the space for a while, that they assume that you should have a certain type of background to be able to approach and solve challenges in that space, which obviously you do need to have some access to kind of specific knowledge and understanding of the nuances of, how an enterprise will construct and approach its own kind of cybersecurity problem set. But at the same time, actually looking at problem from a different vantage point is the opportunity, and that's where the best innovation emerges, right? And so I do think, like to your point around the opportunity to actually kind of open up these spaces a little bit more is important, and the benefit of bringing in that kind of diverse thinking to challenge the status quo is really important. The other thing is that most of from what we see day to day, most of the challenge I would say about particularly early stage companies is commercialization and commercial skills. And I say that in the broad sense. It's not just about selling. It's about customer engagement, understanding, profiling your customer, marketing, communications, like all of those things, which are kind of non-specific to a particular domain. That's where I think there's a huge opportunity and, to kind of join the dots across different domains and people who have got expertise in a different area or a particular functional set of expertise to draw into some of these deep tech spaces where maybe that kind of depth isn't quite there, certainly at the early stages.
And I'm hearing it time and time again from fans. Investors now are demanding more and more kind of commercial traction before they're willing to invest. And when you've got incredibly technical founders that lack this commercial experience, it seems like a really big gap and challenge facing these businesses.
The only challenge I'd say to that, or I'd give that, which is true, I do agree, but I have seen investors be more open-minded to people who have, at an early stage, to back founders with conviction, where they have clearly validated a problem space. And that's where I think often the first stages of, trying to kind of, in entrepreneurship, in our experience, often the initial problem is that a founder would obsess about the solution, not the problem. And actually obsessing about the problem, validating, do people care about this? Like, I know I care about it, but does anyone else care? And if they do, how much do they care? And are they approaching it already? Are they trying to solve it? Is it an unmet need? Is there a better way? And actually, if they care that much, would they even pay for it? And how much would they pay? Like, those are all things that you can do without building anything. And that's where we don't see enough effort often. And this is why, investors demand more and more traction and numbers, is because often the metrics of having had those conversations and the data points aren't there, and they haven't got the evidence to back you. And so in absence of those data points, they're going to ask for, solid evidence, which is obviously revenue and demand. But particularly if you're in a new space, which is, often the case with genuinely cutting edge innovation, the market might not be there yet, but the extent to which you validated that or not is really important. And we are seeing investors back people in the UK, akin to how they do in the US at times, off an idea and off a PowerPoint.
Well, I think it's interesting, and this kind of segues us on nicely. What are the lessons we can learn looking at the US, looking at Israel, and looking at Asia, where I know you're doing work?
Yeah, I think the sort of big opportunity is, look, we've got a thriving ecosystem. It's growing year on year, double-digit growth. It's a sized economy. There's a decent market, and we're lucky in the UK that it tends to be a regional hub for a lot of multinational businesses into Europe as well. So therefore, there is the potential, to sell to enterprise. Also, we're seeing government become a more active buyer of cybersecurity, or certainly want to be, a more active buyer. And they've got their own cybersecurity strategy outlining their own kind of set of needs and their own plan to do so, which is great. So the foundations are there. We also have people who now know what they're doing. As in, people have gone through the cycle. They've built a business, they've exited it, and now we're starting to see that kind of cadre of repeat founders emerge. We've got a sophisticated capital base as well, lots of VC money, angel networks. So all of the ingredients are there, which is good. I think the challenge that I see, and the big challenge for founders is, and the main difference when working internationally versus domestically, is the scale of the ambition in terms of, and I don't mean in terms of, the lazy characterization that UK founders aren't ambitious, because I don't believe that's true. I just think the problem with having a good market on your doorstep is sometimes you're not forced to think internationally from day one. Whereas, obviously the most obvious example of this is Israel. I mean, Israeli founders typically are like global from day one in terms of how they think about, scaling and building a business, or building and scaling a business. I think there's something we can learn there, about being much more kind of globally orientated. Often we see entrepreneurs tend to start to think about international expansion a little bit later than peers. And I think that's okay up to this point. That doesn't mean that you're not going to build a good business. But the other feature that is worth highlighting is the technology cycle. The rate of development of tech is accelerating so fast. I mean, AI is a great example of this. It's crazy how fast it's moving. And I just think you need to move faster these days, and you need to think kind of bigger early, because the reality is there's actually quite a lot of money around. Money will flow to the best companies and the best ideas and the best entrepreneurs with the biggest ambition, and those who are able to execute faster than their competition. And because the rate of change is getting faster, I think we need to adapt culturally a little bit to want to move even quicker and think about global earlier in the process as well. The good thing is, like, there's a lot of, like I said, the ingredients are there, right? A lot of the help is out there in the network. So, but that's the main opportunity and challenge. So it's not that there's a lack of money or there's a lack of customers. I think it's the more about where in that kind of cycle do you start to think about how do you access all of the money and all of the customers at scale, which I think should be earlier.
And I think that's one thing that's worth, kind of focusing in on, as you kind of mentioned, the talent density we've got, particularly if you look at AI and cybersecurity, some of the best universities and some of the best students coming out, and through the work you're kind of doing with Plexal, helping these founders have direct kind of connection to these institutes is fantastic. Yes, you've got the Silicon Valley, like you've got the US and you've got kind of hotbeds of talent over there, but it's incredibly hard to get the best talent. That's the sort of the downside people don't think about. But through the work you're kind of doing with Plexal and the density of talent we have here in the UK, it's really ripe. As you said, all the ingredients are there. How do we then balance, wanting people to think bigger, but then not losing founders and losing businesses too early?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, actually. I was having this conversation yesterday with government, funnily enough. My advice to them, and also just generally in answer to your question, is I think we really need to champion our entrepreneurs. I feel like maybe we don't do that enough. I don't know, we go through a weird kind of love-hate relationship with people who succeed in this space. And I just think we should hold them up. We should be proud of them. We should champion their successes. But more importantly, we should champion the failures. That's what I don't think we do well in the UK. We should highlight that it's okay to fail, but you know what? We're going to back the people who give it a go anyway, as opposed to only love you when you have succeeded, which is typically like the kind of British way. And I think there's something just culturally around that, that would be helpful, because it will signal to people that, this work is valid. As I know you work a lot with founders and entrepreneurs. It's a difficult process and it's a long journey, right? No one's an overnight success in these areas particularly when you're building a new business. And I think we should recognize them for that effort. It's so important for our economy. We need new companies, we need new technology, and we need people to be creating jobs. So I think we should champion them more, because ultimately, and maybe it's just a cross section of the areas that we work in or the people we're exposed to, but often I meet founders who, are born and raised here, and they really want to contribute. Like, they want to build stuff that matters, because that's ultimately why you get into the game, right? You want to solve problems that people care about, and you want to make a difference to the world. And that includes making a difference for your country. So I think if we kind of take that as a given, then we should support and champion them more. We should buy from them. We should give them a go. I think government should be a much better customer of early stage innovation. It can make a massive difference from its buying power. I think facilitating access to difficult industries, critical infrastructure. I think all of those things would be super helpful. The ingredients are there, like I said, but a lot of the change, I think, is about, as a nation, how we perceive success through entrepreneurship. I think maybe just needs a bit of a recalibration.
And that's a fascinating insight, and one that's aligned with the previous guest I had on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. Was we were talking about, the VCs across the US, the UK and Israel, and was saying almost in Israel, it's, you are more investable if you have failed before, because they know you're going to have that hunger, you're going to have that sort of desire. If you're coming back in the ring after, being knocked down, you're going to come back hungrier, you're going to come back with those lessons learned. Whereas, as you were saying, and the previous guest was sort of saying this as well, in the UK, there's much more of a risk aversion. If it is a failed founder, they're not going to be massively investable.
Yeah, I also think as well, there's something about challenging perceptions of what an entrepreneur looks like and what it takes to become an entrepreneur, what type of background. I think there's something there about, providing a platform to all of the many talents in this space. And like you say, it's okay to get things wrong. That's good. That's fine, as long as you learn from that. And actually, that will probably give you a higher chance of success in the future. And us being more comfortable with failing. You asked a question earlier about what I've learned from some of these broader programs. I won't name the specific company, but there was a company we worked with where they had quite a public failure, like quite a significant failure in public. Kind of, it was a big product launch and it just didn't go to plan. And one of the most amazing experiences I think I've had in this journey was hearing the CEO talk about that, and what they learned, and also how they faced into it. And that company, funnily enough, is doing pretty well. since then. And actually, the fact that they've come out and said, sometimes when you're trying to do something new and risky, which they were, it doesn't always go to plan, but it's how you kind of bounce back from that. This is what we've learned. This is how we've adapted our business. This is how we've adapted our product. This is what we're going to do next time when we go again. That's actually made people think, you know what? They're a much more resilient and secure business going forwards. What a great bet.
What are the other key things that you've noticed along the way, and probably the hundreds of businesses you and kind of Plexal generally have supported? What are the key characteristics that you see separating businesses that ultimately go on to become successful versus those that kind of fizzle out and die a passion project?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think funnily enough, I think a lot of the difference is around the intangible factors. So there's definitely something around the leadership of an organization, the mindset. There's people we meet who you just know they're gonna be successful, right? They've got that kind of drive and that resilience, which is probably the more important thing than just drive. It's the ability to overcome and also bounce back from setbacks, of which there'll be many along the journey. And so there's that. Then there's obviously, the quality of what they're trying to do. Are they actually addressing something that matters? Like, is it a real problem, or is it an area of interest to them, which is fine, but not necessarily a problem that the world recognizes as needing to be solved? And then there's the functional things around, okay, but how are you approaching that? What are the features of the market? Are there people already in that space? That in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, It's a good signal that maybe people do care about that issue. But, how are you going to compete with that? And what's your play? Is it to de-seat an incumbent? Is it to expand the market and take a slice of that, of that growing market? I think understanding that as well. And then lastly, I think I would say the main difference is definitely a bit of luck as well, because some of these things are timing, right? Like, let's be honest. And you do need to get a bit lucky that, factors align, like the technology is there, the market is there, the customer is there. And then, maybe there's various different tailwinds, where be that regulation or some kind of change that's affecting the propensity for the market to adopt your solution. Often, you can be amazing, but be really unlucky at that, because not all of those factors align, but sometimes they do. And, you go on, you kind of get the benefit of that as well. So I think it would be disingenuous to not recognize that luck always plays a massive factor in success. But obviously underpinning that is a tremendous amount of hard work, resilience, effort, and also precision in terms of how you build a business, how you take a product to market, and how you scale.
It's not all about luck, but there is that luck component to it as well. And as we, I guess, look to the future, what are the major trends and market shifts that you're paying attention to at Plexal, and how are you looking to kind of ride those waves, and how is it kind of shaping your strategy going forward?
Yeah, it's great question. So a couple of things, probably ranging from the technology shifts, but then also to the economic and societal shifts. So on a technology shift, obviously the impact of frontier technologies in particular is of interest to us, but also how these are converging with other technologies. So think AI and cybersecurity, think cybersecurity and quantum, AI and quantum. Though those are interesting, because often you're seeing this kind of aggregation of expertise needed, which again is not necessarily confined within one set of experts. And, our approach is obviously about building an ecosystem and bringing together those different actors who can contribute and collaborate in those spaces. So that convergence of different technologies, I think, is really interesting. The broader themes around, there's a need for growth, right? This country needs to grow. We're kind of flatlining on that. So how can we kickstart innovation, entrepreneurship, including going hyperlocal with that, actually, like, in helping entrepreneurs who are all across the country, or aspiring entrepreneurs to actually build and start and scale companies. How can we provide them with access to world-class advice, but, at a local level? I think it's really important for us. Then more broadly, I said security and resilience is a key part of what we do. And, clearly there's lots of trends happening there. There's a need to broaden and deepen our defense industrial base. There's a need to, expand society's understanding of national security. I mentioned before about that's not just a preserve of government anymore, but actually the private sector has a key role, but also ordinary citizens. Our role in that is about again, convening the conversation at a much more macro level and helping to drive change through the supply chain, through the system, connect emerging technologies to those users who want to adopt them so that we can enhance our security resilience as well. And then lastly, there's also the opportunity, which kind of pulls together all of those things, is that there's a whole community of our country which we believe is underserved. So think about local citizens, local governments that support those citizens, and the need to transform our public services to drive efficiency into those areas. We're really interested in the role that local government has to play, actually, as a potential adopter of emerging technology, and a key kind of catalyst for public sector reform and kind of societal reform as well. We're seeing that as being a really interesting space over the next couple of years, in particular because of the impact of government policy such as devolution. So much more money is going to sit at a local level, which is great, right? Because for ordinary people like you and me, that means that there's an opportunity to hopefully access new kind of business opportunities, create jobs. We want to encourage, I mentioned, entrepreneurship at a local level. You mentioned Manchester as an example of where we're already doing this, but there's other regions around the country as well, and different kind of growth zones that are being set up. So all of those areas combining to be like, okay, so how can we drive change much more deeply across the country? There's a lot happening. There's a lot of opportunity and lots of problems to solve.
Love it. Well, look, Saj, thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the AIIM Growth Partners podcast. It's been an absolute joy having you on.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.